Hi, I'm Greg Butler. In this segment of Lessons on Lifting, we're going to talk about some common problems with TCR valve bodies. Two questions that we often get are, I have air leaking out the exhaust when my hoist isn't running, and the other concerns lack of brake operation in one direction or both. Many times, either of those concerns are in the valve body, and we can take care of that with an overhaul. Today we'll talk about how the valve body works, how we take it apart, how we properly put new O-rings on, how we put it all back together, and make sure that everything works again. Basic operation of the valve body we use our main air, highlighted here in red, and we bleed off a little bit of that air to go to our pendant on pendant controlled hoist, and we call that pilot air since it's just a little bit of air. When the hoist is sitting there, we're not using it, our main air is against the main spool valve and it should be nowhere else in the hoist. That goes to air leaking past the exhaust. If we have air coming out the exhaust manifold, it has to be getting past the main spool valve. So either our main spool valve itself is worn out, or the spool bushing's worn out, or we have a torn O-ring on the main spool bushing. In the down direction, when you push the lever on the pendant, we introduce air into the spool cylinder on the side of the valve body. When that happens, the spool piston pushes the main spool valve over, and it allows our main air to flow out to the air motor, as well as into the brake spool valve, which pushes the spool valve over and allows air to travel down the brake tube to feed the brake. In the up direction, very similar, we introduce air into the spool cylinder on the opposite side. That slides the main spool valve over. We have air goes out to our air motor, only this time in the up direction there's a little chamber in here, which we'll see in a minute. That's like an accumulator chamber for back pressure from the air motor. The back pressure generated in this chamber pushes the brake spool over against the overload limiter spring, and that allows air to flow out the brake tube to the brake. If we're trying to lift too much, or if the overload limiter is not adjusted correctly, when the back pressure in this chamber exceeds the spring pressure on the overload limiter spring, it allows the brake spool valve to compress that spring, and it blocks off air going out the brake tube so that the brake stops working. So we'll go over all these pieces and components inside of here today. We'll talk about how they work, and hopefully we'll get you all fixed up. To start with disassembly of the valve body, we're going to take the exhaust manifold off, step one. So there's our exhaust manifold. Inside of the exhaust manifold, we have our exhaust packing, which is basically a muffler to knock down the sound from the hoist. Replacement packings are included in our overhaul kits. There's also the packing for the exhaust manifold. This is the overload limiter chamber I was talking about. So our exhaust comes out this chamber right here. This is where the back pressure from the motor fills to move the brake spool over. Let's take these side plates off, and then we can see the spool valves inside. So there's the right side plate and its packing. These are the spool cylinders. So when we introduce air into here from our pendant, air comes in here, it pushes against this piston, which pushes our main spool over in the valve body. There's the spool piston, there's the spool cylinder. So that air pushes that piston in like that, and that's what moves our main spool over in the valve body, allowing air to flow out to the brake and the air motor. You always want to inspect these. If people are running dirty, unfiltered air, it is not uncommon to see this get all scratched up inside. If that's the case, our O-ring's not going to seal very well, so you may need to replace the spool cylinder as well. Our brake spool and brake spool bushing go in the top chamber. So it's very important, the direction of these. This is what causes people to not have brake operation. Either of these components will fit into the valve body in either direction. They both have to be correct. Otherwise, we're not going to have brake operation, or we may have it in one direction and not the other. The owner's manual, parts list in the owner's manual does a great job of illustrating that. But you want to have the wide part of the brake spool bushing is going to go into the valve body first. And the end of the brake spool valve that has the two lands right next to each other goes in that direction as well. While we have this apart, we'll reseal everything. Take the other side of our valve body apart. This is the side that has the overload limiter on it. This screw right here is what adjusts the tension on our load limiter spring. So our load limiter sits on there just like that, okay? And you can see we're compressing that spring. By turning that screw in or out, we're either increasing or decreasing the pressure on this spring. There's our packing. There's the spool cylinder from this side. To get the limit shaft out, we have to take this little snap ring off of here. Do not overstretch it, just enough to open it up. Take the limit roller off, pull the hairpin out. There's a spacer that goes on here. This black piece is called the undercover. We've got to take the undercover off. There's 4 bolts that hold it on. There's a packing. There's our limit shaft. There's our main spool actuator. You can see that has a hex on it where it is keyed to the limit shaft. And as the limit shaft comes through, when you put this all back together, you have to make sure that the hole for that hairpin is horizontal. If it's in there and you're one flat off, then your hairpin's going to hit the air motor. So that has to go together so that the hairpin is horizontal. Now that that's out, we can push our main spool bushing and valve out. So now that we have our main spool valve and spool bushing out, we can separate those two components. You want to be careful with these. They're very, very tight tolerances. You don't want to get any nicks or gouges on any of these components. Just like that, okay? We have our main spool bushing and our main spool valve. Now our valve body is completely disassembled. The other thing we need to make sure of that can affect brake operation. So we talked about this accumulator chamber right here for the brake air to move the brake spool. Well, that gets into that chamber through this little hole right here, okay? It comes out of the brake chamber on the inside of the valve body right here. Those holes are very small. I can barely get the end of my pick in them. If they get clogged full of rust or dirt, that also can affect brake operation. So those are two things that you absolutely need to check anytime you service the valve body on a TCR Air Hoist. Since we have all of our components apart, now we can replace our O-rings. Many of these we can just pinch them a little bit and they'll stick up enough that we can pull them off. Some units it might be easier to try and get a pick under them. The only thing, if you're going to use a pick, make sure that you're not carving up the aluminum on the bushing. So we'll pull our O-rings off. We'll set them over here next to the main spool valve. I find that it's always easier to keep a rag handy so your parts can't get away from you as easily. We have a couple different O-rings here that are different sizes. So 3 O-rings for each of those components, plus 1 in the center of each of these spool cylinders. Right there, little one. We'll set those out of the way. And we'll do this one over here. And then we have our brake spool bushing. which has to be sealed against the housing to prevent air leaks. Since we're replacing the O-rings, we don't have to worry about overstretching them. Just grab a hold of them and basically yank them off of there. Okay, so there's all the pieces and parts from our valve body. Looks like a lot, but it's actually very simple. In our overhaul kits, we sell overhaul kits for our air hoist that include all O-rings, all packings or gaskets, silencer material, vanes, vane springs, if that particular model hoist has vane springs. You should also receive with your overhaul kit a sheet that has all the O-rings on it, and it has their position. This, like number 239 right here, that's item number 239 in the parts list. So it's very easy to find out which O-ring goes in which location inside the hoist. There's our silencer material, so we can discard that. And this really just folds up. Fold it up, slide it down in there, just like that, okay? That silencer material is also a good place to determine what's gone through the hoist. Since this is on the exhaust side, anything that went through the hoist is going to get caught in here. So if there's vane pieces in here or vane springs, or if this is all full of dirt or sand or whatever, that'll give us an idea of what has gone through that hoist and what else might be damaged. Brand new vanes if we were going to overhaul the air motor, new vane springs, and all new O-rings and packings. So we're not going to use all this stuff. We will take these new packings, set them over there. All these big O-rings are for other parts of the hoist. You can also pretty much match up O-rings. We're going to have 4 for that main spool bushing that are all the same size. That looks good. And we can compare them against the sheet here. So, for instance, the O-rings for the main spool bushing are item number 238. Item number 238 on our sheet. Seems like that O-ring might be just a bit too big. Oh, perfection. Okay, so there's 238. Some of these O-rings are very, very close. You want to make sure that you're using the right ones in the right spot. So, now that we have our O-rings, I like to just start them in the groove and work the O-ring around, make sure it's not rolled over, make sure there's no twist in it when you put it on. And we'll just load all 4 O-rings on here and make sure that we don't stretch them any further than we need to get them into position. There we go, okay? So now we have 4 O-rings on. Take a little bit of air tool oil, lubricate those O-rings. You never want to put these together dry. Air tool oil works. Some guys use Vaseline. Vaseline works. It'll be fine. Lubricate the inside and outside of the spool and the spool valve. Make sure we get some oil on that. Keep it sliding back and forth. And our spool valve, you just have to slide it straight into the spool bushing and we should be good to go. It has to slide freely back and forth inside of there, okay? So our main spool valve's done. We can move on to our spool cylinders and pistons. So we put a new O-ring on here. New O-ring on the inside of our piston, which I'm not going to kid you, trying to get an O-ring on the inside diameter can be a challenge sometimes, but that one went very well. That goes together like that. You should have an O-ring that goes on the outside diameter. that. Same thing over here. We need new O-ring for inside the, okay. And then we should have 3 O-rings for on our brake spool bushing. Just like that. We'll lubricate those inside of the bushing. And then our spool valve. And we make sure it slides back and forth in there freely. So, now that we have our valve body resealed, now it's time to put it all back together. We talked about the brake spool bushing and the brake spool valve and how they're directional. So, they go in on the accumulator side of our valve body, and on the brake spool bushing, we go in with the wide part first. So that goes in the top bore just like that. The spool valve goes inside of the bushing with these 2 lands first. So we stick that on the inside of the bushing, okay? There's that. The overload limiter is on the other side. So this is called the limiting valve, and it doesn't, people ask about this notch. That notch doesn't really matter, okay? Just stick it in there. Put the spring inside of it, and then put the adjusting tab on top of that. Next, we'll flip the valve body over. We're going to put our main spool valve and bushing assembly into the hoist. We have to be very careful, make sure that we don't tear any of the O-rings. We'll put some oil inside of the valve body on the surfaces that the O-rings seal against. Try and make it as slippery as we can. We want our main spool valve bushing has a big cutout on one side and it's oval on the other side. It's imperative that this side is facing the bottom of the valve body, or the top as we have it oriented right now. So we stick that in. And we're going to have to center it up, just like that, okay? Outstanding. Now, our spool cylinders go in, and each one of them gets an O-ring on the outside of it. There's like a little groove around here. We're going to put that O-ring down in, and that seals that spool cylinder off on the inside and the outside. Okay? Want to make sure that the O-ring's seated down in there flat all the way around. Same thing on this side. Spool cylinder in, put our new O-ring in. Okay, now we have all the valves in our valve body. So the easiest thing to do, we'll grab a new packing for the side plate. Now, I find that it's usually easiest to put this packing on this side first. Now we can stand the valve body up on its side. Grab our other packing and our other side plate. On the side with the overload limiter, there's also a little roll pin here that we have to have that roll pin lined up with this hole. So the 2 side pieces are different, they're not interchangeable. We have to put our main spool actuator and the limit shaft in. So this main spool actuator can be a little challenging. I like to grab it with a pair of needle nose pliers. You can stick it right down in the hole in the bottom of the hoist and make sure it's in the main spool valve. Now, our limit shaft comes from the back side or capacity label side of the valve body toward the front. And remember, we have to have the holes for the hairpin have to be horizontal when we put this together. Probably have to lift up on the limit actuator just a little bit. There you go. Our limit shaft's in. We get a spacer. You put the hairpin in and you make sure that the flat part of the hairpin is facing towards the air motor. If you put the hairpin in upside down, it will hit the air motor and won't allow the limit shaft to turn far enough. Now we stick our limit actuator on. If you didn't ruin the snap ring, you can put it back on and reuse it. If you overstretched it, please don't just bend it and try and put it back on there. Put a new snap ring on. Put our new exhaust packing on. Set the exhaust manifold on. Now we can put the undercover on. And what we're going to do, the holes are countersunk on the bolt side, and the hole in the undercover is going to go on the side of the valve body that has the pilot air going to the pendant and the up valve. These are just little bolts. There's no reason to get crazy tightening them up. There you have it. One TCR valve body overhauled. You always want to check and make sure that the limit shaft moves freely in both directions, and we can bolt it on the hoist and check and make sure it works. That concludes our segment on TCR valve body overhaul. Thanks for watching.